Cleopatra died in the year 30 BC. The Great Pyramid was already 2,500 years old when she was born. She lived closer in time to the first moon landing than to the building of the pyramid standing outside her window. Think about what that means. When Roman tourists carved their names into the pyramids, those pyramids were already older to them than the Roman Empire is to us. Egypt was ancient to the ancients. And the Egypt in your head, the pharaohs, the pyramids, the slaves with whips at their backs, is a snapshot. One frame pulled out of a film 3,000 years long. Almost everything in that frame is either wrong or lasted about a tenth of the time you think it did. Here is the part nobody tells you. Egypt was ruled by Nubians, by Libyans, by Persians, by Greeks, by Romans. For nearly half its history, the pharaoh of Egypt was a foreigner. So if Egypt lasted 3,000 years and spent half of it under foreign kings, what exactly was Egypt, and when did it actually die? Start with the reason any of it exists. Egypt is a desert with a river running through it. A green ribbon a few miles wide, cutting through some of the deadliest sand on Earth. 95% of Egyptians have always lived on about 5% of the land. And every single year, the river flooded. Not a disaster, a gift. It laid down a fresh sheet of black mud so fertile that Egyptians named their own country after it. Kemet, the Black Land, not for the people, for the dirt. But a flood erases every boundary line. So every year, someone had to remeasure the fields, settle the arguments, and write it all down. That is why Egypt invented geometry, bureaucracy, and writing. The river forced them to. Around 3,100 BC, a king we call Narmer did something no one had done. He took the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom and hammered them into one country. We know because he carved himself doing it on a stone pallet, holding an enemy by the hair. He wore a double crown, red for the delta, white for the valley, and that single act, uniting the river, created the longest-lasting political entity in human history. Egypt would exist, in some form, for the next 3 millennia. 4 centuries later, an architect named Imhotep did something insane. Instead of a flat mud tomb, he stacked 6 stone platforms on top of each other for his king Djoser, 60 meters high. It was the largest stone building on Earth, and nothing like it had ever existed. And then, in barely 100 years, they went from that to this. The Great Pyramid. 2.3 million blocks, 7 stories of stone every 10 years for 2 decades. For nearly 4,000 years, it was the tallest structure humans had ever made. Now the part everyone gets wrong. There were no slave gangs, no whips. That image comes from Hollywood and from a Bible story about a completely different period, and the evidence against it is overwhelming. In 2013, archaeologists found papyrus in a cave by the Red Sea, the oldest written documents ever discovered. A work diary kept by a middle manager named Mera, who hauled limestone to Giza for the Great Pyramid. He does not write about whips. He writes about logistics, boat schedules, and rations. Bread, beer, meat. His men were paid. They had days off. And near the pyramids, we found their town, their bakeries, and their bodies. The skeletons show healed fractures, set bones, medical care, and they were buried in tombs in the shadow of the pyramid with grave goods so they could go to the afterlife alongside their king. You do not do that for slaves. The pyramids were not a prison. They were a national project. Around 20,000 paid workers, organized into competing crews with names like Friends of Khufu, building the thing that made Egypt one country. The lie lasted 4,000 years. The receipts destroyed it. But step back and ask why any of this was built at all. Because Egypt had an idea about death so powerful that it organized the entire economy around it. The sun died in the west every night and came back every morning. So the dead went west and they came back too. To come back, you needed a body. So Egypt spent 3,000 years perfecting how to stop one from rotting. 70 days, the organs out and into jars. The brain pulled out through the nose and thrown away because they thought it was useless packing. The heart stayed. The heart was where you thought, where you felt, where the record of everything you had ever done was kept. Then 40 days, buried in salt to pull out every drop of water, and hundreds of meters of linen, wrapped with amulets between the layers. And then came the part that should sound familiar. Your heart was weighed on a scale against a single feather. If it balanced, you lived forever. If your life had made it heavy, a monster ate it, and you did not go to hell. You simply stopped existing. To pass, you had to declare 42 things you had not done. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. And because Egyptians were practical people, they buried the answers with you. What we call the Book of the Dead is a cheat sheet for the afterlife. And one thing mattered more than the body, the tomb, or the gold. Your name. Say a dead person's name and they live again. Chisel it off the wall and they are erased from existence forever. That is why Egyptians carved their names into everything. Every monument in Egypt is someone shouting, "Remember me," across 5,000 years. And then the machine broke. A king named Pepi II took the throne as a child and reportedly ruled for over 90 years. Long enough that the entire government calcified around one very old man who could not be replaced. Then, around 2200 BC, the river failed. Not for one season, for decades. A climate event so severe it shows up in sediment cores from Iceland to India. The flood did not come, and the flood was the entire economy. A governor named Ankhtafi carved into his tomb that people were so hungry they ate their own children. A text called the Ipuwer Papyrus describes a world turned upside down, where the rich beg and the poor own everything, and the river is blood. Egypt collapsed. Central government simply stopped existing for over 100 years. The pyramids were robbed. That is the first death, not conquest, drought. The river that made Egypt turned around and unmade it. And then it did something almost nothing else in history does. It came back. A southern king reunited the country and started what we call the Middle Kingdom. Egypt rebuilt itself from nothing on top of its own ruins. But the Middle Kingdom was different, chastened. They wrote the greatest literature Egypt ever produced, and they were obsessed with the Old Kingdom, copying its art, studying its texts, treating it as a golden age already lost. Egypt had become nostalgic for itself. The second death came without a battle. Over generations, people from the Levant settled in the Delta. Traders, workers, families, nobody conquered anything. And then one day, Egypt looked up and the Delta was theirs. We call them the Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands. And for about a century, they were pharaoh. They worshipped Egyptian gods, wrote in hieroglyphs, and ran Egypt as Egyptians. The first foreign kings. They would not be the last. The South never accepted it. A Theban king named Sekenenre-Tau went to war to drive them out, and we have his mummy. His skull is caved in by an axe, a dagger, and a mace. He died on the battlefield. His sons finished the job, and Egypt learned a lesson that changed everything. It had been invaded because it was open, so it would never be open again. It would take the fight outward, permanently, and hold territory hundreds of miles beyond its own borders. This is the new kingdom, the Egypt of your imagination. Tutankhamun, Ramesses, the golden masks, the colossal temples. It is the Egypt everyone pictures, and it is barely 500 years out of 3,000. A sixth of the story. One of its greatest rulers was a woman. Hatshepsut took power as regent for a boy and then simply became pharaoh because Egypt had no word for a female king. So she had herself carved wearing the false beard. Not a disguise, a job title. She ruled for 2 decades of peace and wealth. And after she died, her stepson had her name chiseled off the monuments. Not from hatred, historians now think, but to make the line of kings look tidy. Egypt did not just record history, it edited it. Then came the strangest king in Egyptian history. Amenhotep IV looked at a religion 2,000 years old, with hundreds of gods and an immensely rich priesthood, and abolished all of it. He renamed himself Akhenaten, declared that only one god existed, the sun disk, and built an entire new capital in the middle of empty desert to worship it. Possibly the first monotheist in recorded history, and Egypt hated it. The moment he died, they undid all of it. The city was abandoned. The old gods came back within a few years. His name was struck from the king lists. And the boy who inherited the mess is the most famous Egyptian who ever lived, for reasons that have nothing to do with his reign. Tutankhamun was about 9 when he took the throne and dead by 19. He did almost nothing. He was so unimportant that later Egyptians literally forgot he existed and dumped rubble over his little tomb while digging a bigger one, which is exactly why, in 1922, his was the only royal tomb found nearly intact. Every great pharaoh was robbed. The forgettable boy survived. His fame is an accident of archaeology, and it tells you how much of the rest we lost. Then Egypt got its showman. Ramesses the Second ruled for 66 years, fathered something like 100 children, and covered the country in colossal statues of himself. Where he could not build new ones, he carved his name over other kings' work. He fought the Hittites at Kadesh, nearly lost his entire army in an ambush, and then spent decades carving the battle across Egypt as the greatest victory ever won. He also signed the first recorded peace treaty in history. We have both copies. And then, around 1177 BC, the entire world ended. Not Egypt's world. The world. Every great civilization of the Bronze Age collapsed inside one generation. The Hittites, gone. Mycenaean Greece, gone. Trade, writing, cities, gone. The cause is still argued about. Drought, earthquakes, famine, migration, all at once. And moving through the wreckage came the Sea Peoples, a coalition nobody has ever fully identified, in ships with bird-headed prows, burning everything on every coast. Egypt was the only one that survived. Ramesses III trapped their fleet in the delta and destroyed it, and carved the whole thing on a temple wall so we would know. Egypt alone walked out of the end of the world, still standing. But surviving cost everything. Under that same king, the tomb workers at Deir el-Medina stopped working and marched out because the state could not deliver their grain. The first recorded labor strike in history. Egypt won the war and quietly went broke. A century later, an Egyptian official named Weneman sailed to Lebanon to buy cedar and was laughed at, kept waiting, robbed. His account survives and it is agonizing. Egypt was still there. Egypt just did not matter anymore. That is the third death. The country split. Priests ruled the south from Thebes. Kings ruled the north from the delta. And into that vacuum walked outsiders, one after another, and every single one of them wanted the same thing: to be pharaoh. First the Libyans, desert peoples who had been drifting into the delta for centuries as mercenaries and settlers. Their chieftains became kings, took Egyptian names, buried themselves as pharaohs. Nobody today thinks of them as invaders. They just became Egypt. And then came the ones history buried. Far up the Nile, deep in what is now Sudan, was a kingdom called Kush. Egypt had conquered it, colonized it, taught it Egyptian gods and Egyptian writing for centuries. And then Egypt got weak. Around 727 BC, a Kushite king named Pharaoh marched north, not as a raider. He came, in his own words, to rescue Egypt from the chaos its own rulers had made of it, and to restore the gods properly. He took the whole country, and then he did something no conqueror does. He was crowned pharaoh, worshipped the Egyptian gods, wrote in hieroglyphs, and ruled Egypt more strictly by Egyptian tradition than the Egyptians had in 300 years. These are the Nubian pharaohs, the 25th dynasty. Under a king named Taharqa, Egypt got a genuine renaissance. They dug out buried monuments, restored ancient temples, and revived the old art deliberately because they believed they were the true heirs. And here is the fact that should be famous and is not. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. Roughly twice as many, steeper, narrower, and built by Kushite kings. Almost nobody in the world knows they exist. Their Egypt lasted about 60 years, and it ended against the most brutal war machine of the age. The Assyrians came with iron, and Egypt did not have iron. Taharqa fought them for a decade and lost. The Kushites withdrew south and kept being pharaohs at home for another 1,000 years. And then their names were chiseled out by the next dynasty, and later by European archaeologists who could not accept what the evidence said. A black African dynasty ruled Egypt, restored its religion, and saved its heritage. It took until the last few decades for that to be said out loud. Then the Persians. In 525 BC, the largest empire the world had yet seen swallowed Egypt whole and made it a province. The Persian king was crowned pharaoh. Same throne, same crown, another foreigner. Egypt revolted, again and again, for 200 years. Won its freedom briefly, lost it again. By this point, Egypt had been ruled by Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and Persians, and it still called itself Egypt, and the priests still wrote the same hieroglyphs they had written for 2,500 years. So when a 24-year-old Macedonian named Alexander showed up in 332 BC, Egypt did not fight him. It welcomed him. Anything to be rid of Persia. The priests crowned him pharaoh and declared him the son of a god, and he took it very seriously. He founded a city on the coast and named it after himself, then left and died young. His general Ptolemy took Egypt, stole Alexander's body on the way to the funeral, and started a dynasty that would rule for 300 years. Ptolemaic Egypt was fabulously rich and strange. Alexandria had a lighthouse 400 feet tall, one of the wonders of the world, and a library trying to collect every book ever written. Ships entering the harbor were searched for scrolls to copy. But look closely at who was running it. The Ptolemies were Greek. They spoke Greek, married their own siblings in the Greek royal fashion, and ran Egypt as a Greek-speaking colonial elite. For 3 centuries, not one of them bothered to learn Egyptian, not one until the last of them. Cleopatra the Seventh was the first Ptolemy in 300 years to learn the Egyptian language. She spoke around 9. She presented herself as the goddess Isis, and she was, by blood, Macedonian Greek, not Egyptian at all. She inherited a bankrupt kingdom squeezed between a dying dynasty and a rising Rome, and played the only card she had. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Rome needed her grain more than it needed her dead. She backed Caesar, then Antony, and at Actium in 31 BC, that bet finally failed. Rome won, Antony died, and rather than be paraded in chains through Rome, Cleopatra killed herself. 30 BC, every textbook calls this the end of ancient Egypt. Rome annexed it, and Egypt became a province. Personally owned by the emperor because it was too rich and too important to let any senator near it. Except it was not the end. Not remotely. Under Rome, Egyptian temples kept operating. Priests kept performing rites that were already 3,000 years old. Roman emperors were carved on temple walls in full pharaonic costume, offering to Egyptian gods. Augustus, Nero, Trajan. On temple walls in Egypt, they are pharaohs in the Nem's headdress, making offerings to Horus. Most of them never even visited. The Egyptian priesthood simply carried on, fitting each new ruler into a system that had absorbed foreigners for 1,000 years already. But Rome taxed the temples, restricted their land, and slowly cut off the money that trained the priests. And the priesthood was the only place on earth where anyone learned to read hieroglyphs. The writing was never public. It was a profession passed down. Then Christianity arrived, and it did not negotiate. The old gods became demons. Temples were shut, converted, or defaced. In 391 AD, the Emperor Theodosius ordered every pagan temple in the empire closed. In Egypt, that order ended a religion that had run continuously for over 3,000 years. On the 24th of August, 394 AD, on a temple island called Philae, someone carved a short hieroglyphic inscription into the wall. A priest recording an offering, the way priests had done since before the pyramids. It is the last hieroglyphic inscription ever made. Nobody knows his name. He did not know he was last. But somewhere in the years after that, the final human being who could read the writing of ancient Egypt grew old and died. And at that moment, every temple, every tomb, every monument in Egypt turned into decoration. 3,000 years of records, medicine, poetry, law, letters, jokes, love songs, tax returns, all of it sitting in plain sight, carved on the walls, and not one person alive could read a word of it. That is the death of ancient Egypt, not Cleopatra, illiteracy. For 1,400 years, people guessed. They decided hieroglyphs were mystical symbols, each picture a whole idea, magic writing from a lost age of wisdom. Whole libraries of nonsense were written about it. They were wrong. It was mostly an alphabet, and it mostly spelled out ordinary words. Then in 1799, French soldiers digging a fort in the Nile Delta hit a slab of black stone. The same decree carved 3 times. Once in hieroglyphs, once in everyday Egyptian script, and once in Greek, which Europe could still read. It took 23 years. In 1822, a Frenchman named Champollion cracked it, reportedly ran to his brother's office, said "I have got it," and collapsed. He had just given 3,000 years of dead people their voices back, and what they said was not mystical at all. They complained about their bosses, they wrote love poems, they kept receipts. Mera's pyramid work diary, the strike at Deir el Medina, Anktife's famine, Piye's victory. Everything in this video exists because that stone was found. So count them. Egypt died of drought and came back. Died to the Hyksos and came back angrier. Died in the Bronze Age collapse and was the only survivor. Died to Assyria, to Persia, to Greece, to Rome, and kept being Egypt through every single one. Which answers the question we started with. Egypt was never a race, and it was never a bloodline. Nubians, Libyans, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all sat on that throne. Every one of them put on the double crown and made offerings to the same gods, because Egypt was not who ruled it. Egypt was a system, a river, a calendar, a set of gods, and above all, a way of writing them down, handed from one scribe to the next for 3,000 years without a break. Conquest never touched that. Foreign kings just joined it, and that is why Egypt did not die at Actium, with a Greek queen and a snake. It died on a quiet island in 394 AD, when a man wrote a sentence, and then nobody was taught to read it. Egypt ended the moment it stopped being able to speak for itself, and it is the only dead civilization we ever brought back. Not the buildings, the voice. We can read their mail. We know what a foreman named Mera ate for lunch 4,500 years ago. No other lost world has ever been returned to us like that. Egypt watched everything. It was already 2,000 years old when a scatter of quarreling towns on a rocky peninsula started calling themselves Greeks. Egypt thought they were children. Alexandria was named after one of them. Those children invented democracy, philosophy, theater, and the idea that the universe could be explained without gods. They also invented almost none of it alone, and half of what you were taught about them is wrong. That is the next story.